You know that old saying, the grass is always greener on the other side? Yeah, well, sometimes that grass is fake turf laid over a sewage pit. But let me not get ahead of myself. Hi, I'm Marlowe. Yes, like the poet or the noir detective, depending on how classy you're feeling. And this is the story of how I torpedoed my marriage, my family, and, let's be honest, my dignity. All for a man I barely knew. It started innocently enough, I swear. My husband, Bram, and I had been together since forever. Like I was 21 when we met, and let me tell you, back then, he was the guy. Funny, solid, the kind of man who remembered to fill your gas tank without being asked. We built this beautiful, stable life together. A house, 3 kids, a dog who I may or may not have liked more than Bram at times. But somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling alive. And look, I know how that sounds. Poor Marlowe, bored in her big house with her doting husband and 3 grown kids. How tragic. But I wasn't me anymore. I was just someone's wife, someone's mom, someone who vacuumed a lot. And then came Zach. Oh, Zach. The name alone sounded like trouble. He was the new guy at my office, a graphic designer, or, as he liked to call himself, a visual storyteller. I mean, come on. He had these stupidly perfect tattoos, like they'd been curated for an art exhibit, and a way of leaning in when he talked to you, like you were the only person in the room. One day, we were chatting by the coffee machine, and he asked me, "Marlowe, when was the last time you did something for you?" And I froze, because, well, when was the last time? That's how it started. Harmless conversations about life, dreams, and how Bram didn't get me anymore. I know cliché, right? Cue the world's tiniest violin. But Zach made me feel seen. Like I wasn't just a wife with a casserole dish in one hand and a grocery list in the other. Like maybe, just maybe, I could still be the girl who danced barefoot in the rain. And before I knew it, I was sneaking out of the office on my lunch breaks to meet him at this tiny coffee shop where no one knew us. I told myself it was nothing serious, just a little harmless excitement. But there's nothing harmless about a man who knows how to look at you like you're the most interesting story he's ever heard. I wish I could say I fought harder against it, that I thought about Bram, or our kids, or the years we'd spent building a life together. But the truth is, I let myself fall, head first and dizzy, into Zach's world. And once you've tasted that kind of reckless freedom, it's hard to go back to casserole dishes and grocery lists. So there I was, living a double life like some third-rate soap opera character. At home, I was Marlowe the responsible, folding laundry, making dinner, listening to Bram talk about his work like I wasn't dreaming about someone else. And then there was Marlowe the rebel, sneaking out to meet Zach, my visual storyteller, who probably couldn't balance a checkbook to save his life, but somehow made me feel like a damn queen. It wasn't long before things spiraled. Zach wasn't the kind of guy who did things halfway, you know. He'd call me late at night, knowing Bram was snoring 2 feet away, and whisper, "I can't stop thinking about you, Marlowe. I want to steal you away. Steal me away," like I was some prize in a carnival game. And here's the worst part. I liked it. I mean, what woman doesn't want to feel like she's worth stealing? Then came the weekend that changed everything. I told Bram I was going to a girls' trip with my old college friends. It wasn't a complete lie. I did text them once from the road, just to keep the alibi solid. But in reality, I was heading to Zach's place, a loft apartment that looked like an Urban Outfitters catalog threw up on it. Edison bulbs, vinyl records, a plant he called Steve. I spent 48 hours there, wrapped up in this reckless, giddy haze of wine, bad indie music, and the kind of attention that made me forget I had a husband waiting for me at home. When I got back on Sunday night, Bram was waiting for me in the kitchen. He had that look, half worried, half suspicious, like he wasn't sure if I'd been with girlfriends or committing tax fraud. I played it cool, of course. Kissed his cheek, said I was exhausted from the trip. But something had shifted. Bram wasn't stupid. He knew. Maybe he didn't have proof yet, but he knew. That week, I came home to find my suitcases on the porch. Bram was standing there, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He said, "If you're going to disappear for 2 days without a word, then you can disappear for good." And just like that, I was out. I'd love to tell you that I cried, begged him to take me back, promised to change. But I didn't. Instead, I grabbed my things and drove straight to Zach's. Because in my head, this was freedom. This was my new life. Messy, spontaneous, full of potential. I thought I was choosing happiness. Spoiler alert, I was choosing chaos. 2 months into my fresh start with Zach, and let me tell you, it wasn't exactly the rom-com montage I'd imagined. You know, the one where the woman finds herself while twirling in a flowy dress on a windswept beach? Yeah, no. Turns out, freedom comes with dirty laundry, unpaid bills, and a man-child who thinks a good dinner is ordering Thai takeout 3 nights in a row. Zach's loft was an experience. At first, I thought it was quirky, like the mismatched furniture and the random art supplies strewn everywhere gave it character. But after tripping over the same paint cans for the 5th time and realizing the dishwasher didn't work, and hadn't in years, the charm wore off. Fast. But hey, I told myself this was just part of the adjustment. Life is messy, Marlo. You're living, not just existing. I repeated that line so many times I almost believed it. Then there was Zach himself. God, he was magnetic. He could talk his way out of anything, like when he forgot to pay the electricity bill and the lights went out mid-Netflix binge. "Babe," he said, lighting a candle like he was starring in a Victorian romance, "who needs electricity when we have this?" He gestured at the dimly lit room, where Steve the plant was looking particularly droopy. I laughed because, well, what else was I supposed to do? Admit that maybe Bram, reliable, boring Bram, would never let the lights get cut off? No thank you. Speaking of Bram, he called me a few times during those 2 months. At first, I ignored him. What could we possibly have to talk about? He'd kicked me out, remember? But one day, curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. His voice was steady, calm, too calm. "Marlo," he said, "I think we should talk about the divorce. Maybe take a step back and think this through." I almost laughed. Step back? Bram, you threw me out like last week's leftovers. I'm not the one who needs to rethink things. There was this pause, you know, the kind where you can tell someone's choosing their words carefully. "I didn't throw you out, Marlo. You made your choice. But if you ever want to come back, we can talk." My stomach twisted, but my pride stepped in before I could process the weight of what he'd said. "There's nothing to talk about, Bram. You wanted me gone, and now I'm gone. Enjoy your perfect, tidy life." I hung up, shaking but victorious, or so I thought. The kids were a different story. Nolan and Wes had practically dropped off the map. Nolan, my oldest, sent me one curt text. "Mom, don't bother." Wes was a bit softer but still distant. "Dad said you're doing okay," he told me in a rare phone call. That true? I didn't know what stung more, the fact that they were talking to Bram about me, or that I had no good answer. Emma, sweet Emma, was my lifeline. She'd call every week, her voice warm but strained, like she was carrying a weight too heavy for her. "Mom, how's Zach?" she'd ask, and I'd gush about his latest mural or some goofy thing he'd said, like I was trying to sell her on a life I wasn't even sure I believed in. "That's great," she'd reply, but I could hear the disappointment seeping through the phone. Meanwhile, Zach kept the illusion alive. Sure, he couldn't keep track of a budget to save his life, and his charisma was starting to feel more like irresponsibility with good PR, but he still knew how to pull me back in. Like when he showed up with a bouquet of sunflowers after I'd had a meltdown over the mountain of laundry in the corner. "For my sunshine," he said with that grin, and I melted. Because I wanted to believe. I needed to believe. But late at night, when Zach was snoring and the loft was too quiet, doubts would creep in. What if Bram was right? What if I had made a mistake? But then I'd shake it off. I wasn't going to crawl back to the life I'd left behind. I wasn't going to admit failure. Not yet. I turned 46 this year, And let me tell you, starting over at this age isn't as glamorous as those self-help books make it sound. Sure, there's freedom in letting go of the past, but there's also a whole lot of logistical headaches. At least the divorce itself was pretty smooth. I mean, our kids, Nolan, Wes, and Emma, are all adults now. No custody battles, no child support. Just two people dividing up the life they built together like it's an estate sale. Bram and I worked out the finances through our lawyers. I left him the house. It just seemed easier that way. Plus, it was full of memories I didn't want to sift through. In exchange, he agreed to pay me a small lump sum for my share. My retirement savings, plus a small part from my house, I ended up with about $500,000. Enough to start fresh, or so I told myself. The boys didn't make things easy though. Nolan, my oldest, could barely look at me during those final days. He didn't yell, didn't argue, just this cold, stony silence that felt worse than anything he could have said. Wes wasn't as harsh, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. Every time he texted me, it felt like he was holding back, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Emma, sweet Emma. She chose to stay with Bram after I left, and I couldn't blame her. But she still called, still checked in. I just want you to be happy, Mom, she'd say, even though I knew she didn't fully understand why I left. How could she? I barely understood it myself. Then there was Zach. He was thrilled when I told him the divorce was finalized. It's official, babe, he said, wrapping his arms around me like we'd just won the lottery. And for a while, I let myself bask in that feeling. I ignored the quiet voice in my head, whispering that something felt off. Because Zach was still Zach, charming, attentive, always ready with a compliment or a joke to lighten the mood. If there were cracks in his armor, I didn't see them yet. Or maybe I didn't want to. The real turning point came just after the divorce. I was exhausted that day, emotionally wrung out from signing the papers and officially closing the chapter on 25 years of marriage. When I got back to Zach's loft, all I wanted was to collapse on the couch with a glass of wine and forget the world for a while. I tossed my bag on the table, along with my documents and bank cards, and left them there, too drained to care. It wasn't like me to be careless, but then my phone rang and everything else faded into the background. It was my mom. My dad had fallen and broken his hip. My parents are in their 70s, and I knew what that meant. Recovery would be slow, painful, and they'd need help. My mom sounded so small on the phone, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. "We need you, Marlo," she said, and there was no hesitation in my response. I packed a bag in record time, called my boss to request emergency leave, and told Zach I'd be gone for a couple of weeks. He was so supportive, so understanding. "Your family needs you," he said with that easy smile of his. "I'll hold down the fort here. Don't worry about a thing." He even kissed me goodbye, and I believed him. I trusted him. Looking back, I can't believe how blind I was, how I didn't see the cracks starting to show. But I'd find out soon enough. I was completely consumed with my parents for those 2 weeks. Between coordinating my dad's surgery, finding a rehab clinic, and making sure my mom wasn't overwhelmed, I didn't have the bandwidth to think about much else. It was chaos, insurance forms, endless phone calls, and trips back and forth to the hospital. The whole time I kept telling myself, "You're doing the right thing. Family comes first." Then, at the end of that second week, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, thinking it was another telemarketer, but something told me to answer. It was a man from the bank. "Mrs. Wilder?" he said in that overly polite tone that immediately set off alarm bells. "We've noticed some unusual activity on your account. As a precaution, we've temporarily frozen your funds." I blinked, not fully processing. Frozen my funds? What kind of activity are we talking about? There have been multiple large transactions flagged as suspicious, tens of thousands of dollars. And after the amount started exceeding hundreds of thousands of dollars, we simply blocked your account. We attempted to notify you, but the alerts went to your registered phone number. Now I was panicking. "What alerts?" I didn't get anything. There was a pause, and I could hear him typing on a keyboard. The alerts were sent to your registered phone number associated with your account. I called your number but no one answered, so now I called your backup number. My stomach dropped as I realized exactly what he meant. My second phone, the one I'd been using before the divorce, the one I left at Zach's loft in the rush to get to my parents. The phone that was now sitting God knows where, with God knows who. I tried to stay calm. How much money is left in the account? Another pause, and this time his voice softened. The balance is just under $100,000. My knees buckled. Just under $100,000? Years of working, saving, and being careful, all gone. I hung up and immediately called Zach. Once, twice, 3 times, nothing. Straight to voicemail. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like my ribs would crack. I grabbed my bag, told my mom I had to leave, and jumped in the car. The drive back to Zach's loft was a blur of panic and fury. My mind raced with questions. What had he done? How could I have been so stupid? But even then, a tiny part of me clung to denial. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe there was an explanation. When I opened the door to his apartment, all hope of a misunderstanding evaporated. The place was a wreck. Empty bottles littered every surface, and the air was thick with cigarette smoke. The once quirky, artsy loft now looked like a frat house after a 4-day bender. Zach was sprawled on the couch, half-conscious, an unlit cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked up at me with glassy eyes and mumbled, "Hey babe, you're back early." I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. What the hell is this?" I shouted, waving my arms at the disaster around me. He just stared at me blankly, like he didn't understand why I was upset. "Zach," I said, my voice trembling. "What's going on? Where's my money?" That seemed to snap him out of his stupor. He sat up, or tried to anyway, and slurred, "Relax, Marlo. It's not a big deal. I just borrowed some, that's all. I'll win it back." "Win it back?" My voice cracked. "What are you talking about?" And then it hit me. The trips to the casino, the late nights he'd call small online project, the way he'd always seemed to be waiting on a payout. He was a gambler, a compulsive, pathological gambler. He'd blown through tens of thousands of dollars of my savings, chasing some delusional dream of hitting it big. I collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Years of careful planning, hard work, and sacrifice, all gone. Zach, meanwhile, leaned back against the couch, grinning like a fool. "It's okay, babe," he slurred. "We'll figure it out. I got a system, you'll see." A system, that's what he called it. And in that moment, as I looked at the man who had wrecked my life, I realized he didn't just ruin me financially, he'd broken something inside me. I didn't even have the energy to scream at him. I just sat there crying while he muttered half-hearted jokes to cheer me up. This was the man I left Bram for. This was my freedom. And now I had nothing. I'd never stepped foot in a police station before that day. Sitting in that cold, sterile room, recounting every sordid detail of what Zach had done, I felt like I was living someone else's nightmare. The officers were polite but detached, asking me to fill out forms and hand over whatever proof I had. Statements from the bank, copies of my frozen accounts, anything that painted the picture of the financial ruin Zach had left me in. By the end of the day, they'd picked him up. I didn't even want to know what state they found him in. The thought of his smug grin, the slurred excuses, the ridiculous charm he used to wrap me around his finger, it made my stomach turn. The officer handling my case told me Zach would likely face charges for fraud and theft. "He'll probably do time," he said, as if that was supposed to make me feel better, but it didn't. Nothing could. Because the money? It was gone. Every penny he gambled away, every bottle of alcohol, every ridiculous expense, it was all irretrievable. My savings, my security, my future. Gone. And then, as if the universe hadn't beaten me down enough, my parents needed help. My dad's surgeries were more complicated than we'd hoped, and the bills were piling up. Insurance covered some of it, sure, but there were still medications, physical therapy, home care, all the little things that add up. My mom, bless her, tried to manage on her own, but she was overwhelmed. And how could I look them in the eyes and say, I can't help? They were my parents. They needed me. The last $100,000 in my account didn't last long. Between the hospital bills, paying down my own debts, and trying to keep my head above water, I watched the balance shrink every week. It was like standing on a sinking ship, bailing water with a thimble. I kept telling myself I'd figure it out, but I didn't know how. That's when I did the thing I swore I'd never do. I called Bram. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady as ever. Marlo. Hearing his voice made my throat tighten. I tried to hold it together, but the tears came anyway. Bram, I need to talk to you. He didn't sound angry or cold, just tired. What is it? I told him everything. Zach, the money, my dad. How I'd lost everything because of my own stupidity. I didn't sugarcoat it. I couldn't. I admitted my mistakes, begged for forgiveness, told him I'd been wrong about everything. I was an idiot, Bram, I said through sobs. I threw away our life for a man who destroyed me. I know I don't deserve it, but can we try again, please? There was a long silence on the other end. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. Marlo, I'm sorry for what you're going through. Really, I am. But I can't go back. I've moved on. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Moved on? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Yeah, he said. But listen, if your dad needs help, I'll take care of it. I'll send the money directly to the hospital. And he did, because that's who Bram is. Honest, kind, noble to a fault. He didn't owe me or my family anything, but he still stepped up. He paid for my dad's surgeries, never asking for a thank you or a word of recognition. He just did it because it was the right thing to do. That's the kind of man I threw away. I spent the next few months trying to fix things, trying to show him I'd changed. I called, I wrote letters, I even showed up at his office once. But he kept his boundaries firm. He'd made his decision, and no amount of apologies or promises was going to change that. And then, one day, Emma called me. She sounded hesitant, almost afraid to say the words. Mom, Dad's seeing someone. I dropped the phone, literally. It clattered to the floor as I sat there, stunned. My Bram, with another woman, someone who wasn't me. I had no right to be angry or jealous, I knew that. But it didn't stop the pain. I cried for days, knowing I'd lost him for good, knowing that I'd been replaced. But you know what? I can't blame him. After everything I put him through, he deserved happiness. He deserved someone who wouldn't take him for granted. I just wish it didn't hurt so much. Starting over at 46 isn't easy, but it's the only choice I have. After everything that happened, I'm just trying to put the pieces of my life back together. My dad's recovering well. Thankfully, the surgeries went smoothly, and he's on the mend. That's one bright spot in all this mess. My mom and I have grown closer too. I guess shared struggles have a way of doing that. But the rest? It's hard. Every now and then, I catch myself wondering about Bram and that woman he's with. Is she kind to him? Does she laugh at his dumb jokes the way I used to? I hate to admit it, but yeah, I'm jealous. Not just of her, but of the life they're building together, a life that used to be mine. It hurts knowing that some doors, once closed, can never be reopened. For so long, I thought I could fix my mistakes, but now I know better. Some mistakes stay with you, no matter how much you want to undo them. Now, I live alone in a modest apartment, just a small place with thin walls and a leaky faucet I keep meaning to call the landlord about. I work extra shifts whenever I can, trying to rebuild my finances and keep myself busy. It's not glamorous, but it's life, and it's mine. I've learned a lot through all this, about choices, about consequences, about what really matters, If I could go back and do it all differently, I would in a heartbeat. But life doesn't give us do-overs. All we can do is pick ourselves up, one day at a time, and try to do better. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. I'll never make the same mistake again. Once you've lost everything, you realize what truly matters. And for me, that's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life.